Moving into the Irish in Sioux City, for those of you wondering why we are doing a program on the Irish in August, I had actually prepared this program to give back in March of 2020, but of course things like pandemic things happened, and so here we are in August. But this has been sitting in the bay for a while, and I'm really excited to get this talk. It's some really cool bit of history and some really interesting families and figures that I get to discuss in this talk today. Before I get into it, I do want to extend a couple thank yous. A lot of the information that you will see and a lot of the images that you'll see came from the works and writings of Grace McCarty. She was the child of Irish immigrants who settled here in Sioux City, and you'll get to meet them later. And she wrote extensive histories not only on the Irish in Sioux City, but her own experiences on growing up where she did and on early Sioux City in general. So I want to extend a big thank you to her. This talk that you're about to see is also a reworked talk that was given in the past by our former curator, Grace Linden. And so I want to extend a thank you to her as well as our volunteer, Sue Waples. They both did a ton of research and put together some of this talk. I just did some more of my own research, added some things, changed some things, and kind of made it my own. So I'm an Irish nerd. I love Irish history. And don't have a ton of Irish ancestry, but it's still such a fun history to study. For the lost, here's a modern map of Europe and the British Isles right up here to the northwest, and this is the island of Ireland. Today, Ireland is split into two different countries. You have the Republic of Ireland in the south, which is its own independent nation, and then the upper counties of Northern Ireland are part of the United Kingdom. They form Northern Ireland. But historically, this wasn't always the case. Ireland, and even today, Ireland still has a very strong national identity with the whole island, not just the southern parts. So when I talk about Irish immigrants, know that I'm talking about people who were coming from all over Ireland and settling here in Sioux City, not just from the modern Republic of Ireland. But why are the Irish coming here? Why are we getting the sudden mass of Irish immigration? Well, to do that, I have to, in the fastest way ever, cover an entire half century of Irish history. I will try to make this as brief and as clear as I possibly can. In 1800, we have the passage of the Acts of Union. This made Ireland an official part of the Kingdom of Great Britain. There's a long history of wars and conflicts before that, but just know in 1800, we have the passage of the Acts of Union that makes Ireland a part of Great Britain. Now, Great Britain is a Protestant nation, and its monarch is the head of the Anglican Church, and this spells a big issue for the largely Roman Catholic Irish. We have English Protestants moving over, buying up land, and in general just persecuting the Catholics that are living in Ireland. They were barred from running from public office. They were barred from holding certain positions. Occasionally they were kicked off their lands, or their lands were subdivided. They had restricted access to resources and produce. And all in all, it was just not a great situation. There were attempts to curtail this, like in 1829 with the passage of the Roman Catholic Relief Act. But this didn't stop the social prejudices that were going on and just the general subjugation of the Roman Catholic Irish. This is the stage that is set during the 1840s and early 1850s when we get the Great Famine, or the Irish Potato Famine, as it is known largely outside of Ireland. I mentioned that limited access to resources and produce. Well, that made the largely rural, poor farmers of Ireland very dependent on a high-calorie, very cheap crop, the potato. And when your potato crop fails after several seasons, they don't really have access of anything else to eat. And so this became a very big problem. You can see wood cuttings and articles of people literally starving in the streets, both in rural villages and in the cities. Sorry. So now the Irish are faced with a choice. Do we stay in a land where we are starving and the government is not on our side, or do we leave? Statistics vary depending on which source you read of what exactly these numbers are, but it's estimated that 1/4 of Ireland's entire population either succumbed to the famine or left the island entirely. And Ireland's population to this day has never recovered from this huge drop that it experienced in this era. A lot of these Irish came to the United States and its promises of the brand new world and its expanding western area, but everything is not hunky-dory for them when they get here. In the 1840s and 1850s in the United States, you have the rise of what is called the Native American Party, also called the Know Nothing Party. This is an anti-immigrant political party that is trying to protect what they saw as the regular Americans' native life, so people who had been living here, who had established communities, trying to protect their jobs and their finances and their neighborhoods from the sudden flux of immigration. And they were especially hard on the Irish because the Irish were coming here with absolutely nothing. It was not uncommon in places like New York and cities on the East Coast to see these help wanted, no Irish need apply signs. Catholic churches were closed en masse, and often these persecutions erupted into actual violence. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, you can see Hollywood's interpretation of what this persecution actually looks like. It's a great movie, go watch it, it's awesome, though a little sad. So now, the Irish are coming to a new world and they're getting persecuted here as well, so what are their options left? Well, America is starting to expand west, past into the Mississippi, and now the Midwest and over into the western United States are opening up for settlement. So a lot of these Irish are fleeing the East Coast, heading west, and trying to find new communities and new colonies where they can protect and preserve their way of life. Places like Sioux City. So Sioux City began in the winter of 1854-1855 and was incorporated into the Iowa state government in 1857. But there were some Irish either settling here briefly or just passing through this area before that point. So I'm going to mention those briefly before I get into our actual Irish settlers here in Sioux City. The first Irishman through this area was Patrick Gass. He was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He has Irish ancestry, though he was born in Pennsylvania, and he was elected sergeant upon the death of Sergeant Charles Floyd in 1802. According to Grace McCarty, it was Patrick Gass who made the original oak coffin for Sergeant Floyd, and we have pieces of this coffin actually on display out in our gallery by the cabin. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out. It's pretty neat. Patrick Gass was also the longest surviving member of the expedition. He did not die until 1870. Down in this picture, this of course was taken much later, but this is a shot of Floyd's grave in about 1894, what that originally looked like before we of course put a giant monument on it. Another early settler was Robert Perry. He was born in Northern Ireland and came to this area in August of 1849. According to Grace McCarty, he settled on a creek on the west side of town near where one day 7th, West 7th, and Pearl would be. And of course, that creek now bears his name, which is where we get the name Perry Creek. I've made a little dot here showing about where Robert Perry is thought to have settled. This is on a later map from 1855. And down here, you have Joe Lyonnaise's settlement. Joe Lyonnaise worked very closely with Dr. John Cook, who helped form the town of Sioux City. So Lyonnaise is living down by the Missouri River, and Robert Perry is up here. Perry left around 1852 after being harassed by Native Americans, and if you believe the legend, those Native Americans were actually sent by our first settler, Theophile Bruyere, who was on good relations with the Native Americans, who sent them to attack Robert Perry as a joke. Life on the frontier. Another important figure through this era in this time is Reverend Jeremiah Tracy. He was born in Ireland in 1821, and in June 1855, he passed through this area, leading a group from Dubuque, Iowa, into the newly opened Nebraska Territory to form a colony. This was a popular movement in this time period, where Irish are banding together and heading out west to form new cities, new colonies that are just Irish, just Catholics, so they won't face that persecution they were seeing elsewhere. He founded the town of St. John's, Nebraska, which is today Jackson, but he passed through Sioux City, and we have copies of his journals. He mentioned Sioux City and the small cluster of cabins that served as the town at that time. So he's actually an important early resource for early Sioux City as well. Tracy was also influential in founding the church in Omaha and the Irish Immigrant Aid Convention in February of 1856. This was a regular convention held to help raise funds and raise awareness for the plight of the Irish in the United States and their struggles to form communities here. And later on, he moved to Alabama. All right, so those are kind of passers through or early settlers, but as far as permanent settlers, families that came to Sioux City and stayed here for quite a while, those start in right about 1857 until, I was going to cut it off at 1900, but there were some other people I wanted to include, so I kind of just pushed it forward to 1908, but it's fine. Grace McCarty says that the first Irish permanent settlers in Sioux City were John and Mary Fitzgibbon. No, not that Fitzgibbons, not the Fitzgibbons from the bookstore. You'll notice a lot of Irish families have very similar or sometimes identical sounding names. Just because they have the same names did not always necessarily mean they're related. I'll mention those relationships when they pop up, but they're usually not related, or if they are, it's so far back that I'm not going to research into that to figure out how. But John and Mary Fitzgibbon came to Sioux City in May of 1857. John was a contractor. He built several buildings around town, including the Mondayman Hotel at 4th and Pierce Street. This later burned down and was replaced with the Hotel Martin. He was also a key contractor on several railroads through town, including the Milwaukee Road and the Dakota Southern Railroad up into South Dakota. His son Richard started a drayage and van line, which is a really fancy way of saying a moving company, and John Fitzgibbon died in 1904. I think I'm going to sneeze. Daniel and Rose Harnett, they came to Sioux City in May of 1857. Daniel was a stonemason. He worked very closely with John Fitzgibbon and was credited with helping build many of the church buildings around town. He died in 1888. However, the Hartnett family lived on 6th Street right near Perry Creek for over 50 years. And Grace McCarty mentions that Daniel Hartnett converted a bunch of vacant lots on the bank of Perry Creek for a park that was the joy of all beholders from the 6th Street Bridge. And another thing you'll notice about these Irish families, they tend to have a lot of kids. To Daniel and Rose Harnett were born 8 children, 2 boys and 6 girls. Here you can see Rose Harnett pictured with her 6 daughters. New family, the Jeremiah and Bridget Kelly family. They came to Sioux City in May of 1857. They originally were farmers. They farmed land in what was known then as Bacon Hollow, which was just a stretch of land near Bacon Creek. But in 1867, they moved closer to downtown Sioux City and built the Mountaineer House Hotel. This was very important because its location at 4th and Virginia Street was right on the line of the Sioux City and Pacific Railroad. This came up from Omaha and Council Bluffs, connecting us to the Union Pacific, and was the first railroad in Sioux City, coming here in 1868. So this hotel was vitally important because it was one of the first buildings you'd come across in Sioux City after leaving the station. Jeremiah's brother Daniel came to Sioux City in 1859 with his wife Bridget. He also farmed on the east side of town. But keep in mind, Sioux City, it spread relatively quickly, but just because something is in the city limits doesn't mean that it's actually in town. So they actually lived near 7th and Wall Street, which Wall Street is modern-day Floyd Boulevard, which at the time was enough out of town to start a farm. So they had 7 children. Their oldest daughter, Mary, married this guy, George Kingsnorth, because I didn't have a picture of Daniel and Bridget Kelly. George Kingsnorth is what I call a professional old person. He came to Sioux City in 1859 and lived until he was nearly 100, and he just lived here so long that he knew everything about the town, he knew how it grew, and he had done pretty much everything you could do in an early town like that. He was mayor, he was postmaster, he does all these things. So yeah, George Kingsnorth was definitely prominent, and he married Daniel and Bridget Kelly's daughter. Daniel and Bridget's son Cornelius, also called Con, was born in 1846 in Ireland. He came to Sioux City with his family. In 1862, he joined the Northern Border Brigade. This was a military group that popped up in this area during the Civil War and helped defend local towns and communities from Native American attacks during the Indian Wars of the Civil War. So he was part of that brigade. He married Anna Gunn, sister of Sioux City's first Catholic pastor. They had 8 children, one of whom was Thomas Kelly, who wore this top hat at his wedding. But Con Kelly is most known for founding the neighborhood of Kelly Park. Now, like his father, he farmed on the east side of downtown, but he moved into the city in 1908. When he moved, he subdivided his land and made a brand new neighborhood, Kelly Park. As you can tell from this map of 1888, you can see Kelly Park, or Kelly Field, it was called then, right in the center. That's where this photograph up top was taken, looking out over the houses. But Kelly Park is still around. If you're familiar with Unity Elementary School, if you head straight south from that neighborhood, you'll see a lot of windy streets collected around one central park. That is the Kelly Park neighborhood. I'm going to pause here a second just to talk about what some of these early Irish settlers are doing. The very first Catholic church ever in Sioux City was built by the Irish in 1862. John Fitzgibbon, Daniel Hardnett, all the guys I've been talking about, they were all involved in this church. The original church building sat at West 7th between Perry and Kansas Street, and it was this little building that housed both a church and a school. And they had services in there. Fun fact, actually, this building is still around. It was moved over to West Street and has been since converted into a house, which you can see down here. I don't know if it's still pink. That was taken in 2012, but. So that little Catholic church was replaced in 1875 with St. Mary's Church. The old church had been kind of called St. Mary's, but sometimes called like other stuff. But this one, the one on 6th Street, was officially St. Mary's. It was built at 6th and Pierce, and you can see in the image on the right what that looked like with its tall steeple. That St. Mary's quickly became far too small for its congregation, so it closed in 1890 while construction on a new building at 10th and Douglas started. That opened in 1892 as the new St. Mary's. Now, when Sioux City became its own diocese, the head of its own diocese, that St. Mary's was converted into the Cathedral of the Epiphany. And you can see in this picture right here, that cathedral looks unfinished to us, but it's not. That picture was taken shortly after it's open and was printed in the newspaper. Those cone towers that we're used to seeing on cathedral today, those were not added until 1948. So this building is not half finished. It's complete and then added onto. And I've been mentioning West 7th Street and 6th Street quite a bit even already. Well, that was the concentration of what was known as Sioux City's Dublin, where a lot of these Irish families settled once they came here to Sioux City. Again, this was along 6th Street near Perry Creek, so pretty much anything west of Pearl, but east of Perry Creek, that little stretch of 6th Street right in there, that was Sioux City's Dublin. This picture was actually taken quite a bit after this period where some of these Irish families have moved to other communities, but this shows that stretch of 6th Street very, very well. That was once Dublin. And Grace McCarty mentions that Dublin was a community of homes and homeowners where every home was surrounded by a picket fence and shade-spreading trees. Here you can see it a little bit better and more contemporary on the 1884 Sanborn map. Dublin there is highlighted in green. Grace McCarty and her family lived in Dublin. Her home is right there. And you can see the Irish living here would have just a short walk to go over to St. Mary's Church, which is right over here at 6th and Pierce. Back to the families, Len and Annie O'Hara. They came to Sioux City in 1864. Len started a harness and leather shop in 1895. The shop sold harnesses, shoes, boots, saddle equipment, anything in this time period that was made out of leather, you could find it at O'Hara's store. In 1906, he switched to just selling shoes, and O'Hara's shoe store became a long-standing Sioux City business. It remained family-owned until it finally closed in 1956. We actually have a cool piece from O'Hara's Shoe Store here in our museum, if you're familiar with our Museum Research Center. Right as you walk in, there's a little glass case off to your right that has rotating displays. Currently, it holds this selection of geodes. That was originally a display case for shoes at O'Hara's Shoe Store. All right, I've been talking about Grace McCarty a lot. Now her family finally comes to Sioux City from Ireland in 1867. These are her parents, Lawrence and Eliza McCarty. Lawrence started a grocery store at 6th and Pearl Street, right on the edge of Dublin. But in 1892, he switched from selling groceries to being a Catholic book and stationery store. And keep that in mind, that will be important later. But the McCartys are famous because they have 11 children. Not a single one of their 11 children had any children of their own. Some became nuns, one became a priest, and a few of them did marry, but none of these kids had any kids of their own. So the McCarty line kind of ends with this large generation. Grace is right over here on the right side of your screen at number 7, but these kids are all numbered in order of their age. This is taken in about 1895. And here's the McCarty home at 215 6th Street in about the 1880s. The whole clan is gathered in front there. Mom and Dad are right here by the gate, and Grace is standing over here next to them. And that is Lawrence and youngest girl Eva sitting in the carriage. Grace's older brother Thomas McCarty is relatively famous because he was the first locally born Sioux City priest. I say locally born. He was actually born in Manchester, but he came to Sioux City when he was like 4, so it counts. He's Sioux City's first priest. He was ordained as a priest in 1892 out in Dubuque. Remember, Sioux City was not a diocese yet. And he served as a priest in many Iowa towns, including Sioux City. In 1920, he became pastor of the Cathedral of the Epiphany, and he was invested as vicar general in 1931, and he later died of illness in 1933. Moving on to John and Daniel Deneen. These brothers were born in Ireland and came to Sioux City in 1867. They started a carriage and wagon factory in 1868 called Deneen Brothers and later Deneen and Sons. And they built this block at 4th and Water Street called the Deneen Block in 1888 to house their business and several other commercial spaces. And the Deneens are one of those people who are famous not necessarily for what they did, but how long their building lasted. This building at 4th and Water Street was only recently torn down to make way for the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. And if you're familiar with the 4th Street Cafe or the old Dalton's Pub, that was in that building. And to pay homage to this historic building, the Hard Rock, after it was built a little facade that was representative on the Deneen block, right where that building used to sit at 4th and Water Street. Important Sioux City wholesaler John Hornick came to Sioux City in 1867. He was born in Ireland. He started a wholesale drug company in 1867, and under various names and ownerships, this firm lasted all the way into the 1980s, which is just mind-boggling to me. He also established a wagon road into the Black Hills for the Black Hills Gold Rush, and he was instrumental in building the Sioux City and Northern Railroad up into Garretson, South Dakota. This is important not only for settlement of South Dakota, but also bringing that precious, precious Sioux quartzite down here to Sioux City to build all of our buildings. Patrick Follis, he was Irish and he came to Sioux City in 1868. He was proprietor of the Sioux City House at 5th and Pearl Street. At the time Patrick Follis was living here, this was very important because Sioux City was still heavily dependent on steamboats, though we did have the railroad by then. He died in 1888, but his business stayed around for quite a while until that railroad and 4th Street started becoming the major thoroughfare through Sioux City. Patrick's son, William, though, was quite prominent. He originally was clerk for the Sioux City House under his father, but he grew up to be a charter member of the Excelsior Hook and Ladder Company in 1870. This was one of many private fire department companies around Sioux City that were in charge of putting out fires before the municipal fire department was developed. And Excelsior was one of the earliest ones, so William S. Follis was one of the charter members of what became our municipal fire department. And later he was involved in real estate up in South Dakota. The T.S. Martin family. T.S. Martin was born in Galena, Illinois, but his parents were Irish, and he came to Sioux City in 1868. He started the T.S. Martin Company dry goods store, which later evolved into one of the largest and most prestigious stores in Iowa. He was also involved in a lot of city development. His real estate company built the Francis Building, the current Orpheum Theater, and all sorts of other buildings around town. After he died in 1915, his sons took over the business and oversaw the construction of this building in 1919. I have a whole talk on T.S. Martin and his family and the department store that is currently on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in hearing more about them, go check out that video on the museum's YouTube channel. And here are the Martin boys and Martin's wife, Agnes, in 2901 Jackson Street, their home, better known today as the Pierce Mansion, though the Martins actually lived in there a lot longer than Pierce ever did. Ah, Charlie Collins, one of my favorite figures in Sioux City history ever. Charlie Collins came to Sioux City in 1869, and he was originally editor for the Sioux City Times. This was our first daily paper, though the Journal and the Tribune would become daily papers later. But Charlie Collins was a known eccentric, and there's all kinds of legends and stories about them, some of which I hope are true because they are just so hilarious. I'm going to share a couple of these stories with you now. Around 1872, Charlie Collins was credited as one of the people who originated the name of Prospect Hill. Prospect Hill, which was known as the Big Hill on the west side of town, came about because this lady, Mrs. Emma Andrews Meeker, who was teacher at Sioux City High School at the time, wanted a fundraiser to help put a bell in the school's bell tower. Now, so she approached Charlie Collins and she said, hey, can some of my students help sell your papers in exchange for some of the profits? And he's like, sure, but we need a really, really cool editorial to help sell these papers. So they came up with this story about a bunch of old prospectors who buried brass filings in the side of this hill, dug those brass filings up, and then ran around Sioux City telling everybody they found gold in that big hill on the west side of town. And the editorial ended with, don't know why the name Prospect Hill wouldn't be a good name for that hill. That is the name that stuck, and to this day we call that big hill over by the bridge Prospect Hill. Charlie Collins was also part of the very scandalous Gordon Russell expedition into the Black Hills. Now, in 1874, the Black Hills were still under Native American treaty land, so no white settlers were allowed to be there yet until the gold rush later on in 1877. But there were already whispers of gold being found in the Black Hills, so Charlie Collins and a bunch of other people, led by a guy named Thomas Gordon, went up there anyway, and they built this very elaborate little fortress to protect themselves from the Native Americans. This was again in 1874. They stayed up there for a little while before the U.S. government knocked on their door and said, what are you guys doing here? And my last and favorite tale of Charlie Collins. In 1884, Sioux City was developing a municipal waterworks system, both to help put out fires in the downtown area by drilling lots of wells, as well as bringing water to other areas of town. And they were testing these wells using the different fire hose companies, like the James Wall Hose Cart Company, who you can see here in 1886. Now, Charlie Collins was not a fan of this idea. He thought that the waterworks should be controlled by private companies, which it had been up until now, and so he wrote all kinds of nasty things about this new municipal waterworks system in his newspaper, the Sioux City Times. So one day in 1884, they were testing some of the wells they had drilled downtown right outside of Charlie Collins' office. And if you believe the legend, he looked down, saw what they were doing, and promptly marched himself downstairs and just started giving these nice firemen all kinds of heck. And they responded by turning around and blasting him in the face with fire hose. And we heard no more about the municipal waterworks from Charlie Collins. In the late 1880s, Charlie suffered various injuries he sustained during an assault. Maybe he started it, who knows? But that forced him out of the paper business. He retired to San Diego, where he died in 1893. Very important political figure, at least for the Irish in Sioux City, was John Brennan. John and Annie Brennan came to Sioux City in 1869. John originally was co-editor of the Sioux City Times with Charlie Collins, and later on he practiced law. He was president of the Sioux City Fenian Society starting in 1875. The Fenian Society in Sioux City was a pro-Irish Republic group. This was a group who was advocating for the separation of Ireland from the Kingdom of Great Britain. And these were popping up all over the United States and in Ireland and all over the world. Anywhere there was an Irish community, you had these Fenian societies. And Sioux City and the rest of the Fenian societies were quite prominent. There were other pro-Irish Republic groups like the United Irishmen Association, and I'm pretty sure for anything around here, John Brennan was president of all of them. He wrote national congressmen and even sent international letters both to the Kingdom of Great Britain and to Ireland itself, advocating for the support of the Irish cause and for Irish patriots. So here's a guy with some international prowess from right here in Sioux City. On the business side of things, Thomas Green was born in Ireland. He came to Sioux City in 1869, and he started a brickyard out just east of downtown Sioux City. Again, there wasn't much settlement out there yet. He was digging for clay in the hills that now surround Floyd Cemetery. The workers of that brickyard didn't want to commute all the way from Sioux City out to the brickyard, so they just built their homes right around the brickyard area, and that is how we get the modern neighborhood of Greenville, named for Thomas Green, their boss. Thomas Green tapped out those clay beds, and then he moved up to Springdale, which is how Springdale was founded in 1889. Tom and Mary Malone. Tom Malone is one of those people who, again, is not so famous for him, but more for his building. Tom Malone was born in New York, but his parents were Irish, and he came to Sioux City in 1870. He worked as a blacksmith until he tried to go make his fortunes up in the Black Hills during the gold rush. And when he came back, he started the Tom Malone grocery store, first at 507 Pearl Street and later on at 501 Pearl Street. He built this beautiful building called the Malone Block, beautiful example of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture, and that still stands today. It used to hold Pearl Street plumbing. I don't believe there was anything in there now. I think there was once like an axe throwing place that was going to go in there, but I don't think anything came of that with the pandemic. So I think that building is empty, but it's still really, really cool. Rose O'Connor, she was born in Illinois in 1874, but came to Sioux City that same year, and her father, Michael O'Connor, was Irish, and he was a contractor. Rose O'Connor spent several years with the Sioux City Public Library, and she developed the Hospital Library Service. This was a service that would take library books up to people staying in Sioux City's hospitals, and this was the first service of its kind in the United States. She was also the author of Sioux City, A True Story of How It Grew, telling the history of Sioux City, not only from her own experiences, but from various other sources and various people she talked to. So that's a cool little history book there. And here you can see Rose O'Connor in 1920 at the St. Vincent Surgical Ward, dishing out books to people who were staying there. Oh, the Kellys. So the John C. Kelly family is quite frustrating to research because this family was very prominent, but in every single generation, they have a boy named John. So if you're trying to find John Kelly, it's quite frustrating. So for my sanity and for yours, I have numbered them. This is John number 1. He came to Sioux City in 1880 and purchased the Sioux City Tribune newspaper and turned that into a daily paper in 1884. So John C. Kelly really turned the Tribune into quite the big competitive newspaper with the Sioux City Journal. He remained as editor of the Tribune until his death in 1920. Now, John Kelly had 7 kids, 3 boys, and 4 girls. 2 of those boys, John H., not Jr., because Papa was John C., so this is John H., a different John. I'm calling him John II. And his brother Eugene took over for their father. John became editor of the newspaper, and Gene took over the printing and stationery business side of things. That lasted until John II, or John H. Kelly, died in 1933, and his brother Eugene took full ownership of the Tribune. Around that time, he brought in his sons, John C., who I'm calling John number 3, and Eugene F., who I guess you can call Eugene number 2. They joined their father in the business shortly after John H. Kelly died in 1933. And this lasted until the Tribune merged with the Sioux City Journal in 1941. Eugene retired, left the business to his 2 sons. John C., who again is John number 3, became vice president, and his brother Eugene became secretary of the brand new Sioux City Journal Tribune. The Sioux City Journal Tribune lasted until 1971 when the paper was sold again and became the modern just Sioux City Journal. John C. We have some really cool negatives in our Newman negatives of the John C. Kelly family. Here you can see their Christmas card in about 1946. This features most of their kids. There's 2 not shown because they're not quite born yet. Here you can see Tim, Molly, Meg, E. Kevin, Hagen, and of course another John, John C. Kelly Jr., who I can call John 4. And the Careys, not as complicated as the Kellys, but there's still some complexity here. So the Carey brothers were three brothers that came to Sioux City in 1884. The oldest, Edward J., to work for T.S. Martin, and later became owner of the Martin's department store up in Cedar Rapids. The middle brother, John W. Carey, became managing editor of the Sioux City Journal. He wrote several editorial pieces like The Rear Seat and Who's Who. And the youngest son, Charles, became involved with the T.S. Martin Real Estate Company, building a lot of those buildings around town. And here you can see Charles with his wife in 1939. Now, Charles' son, Edward, was born here in Sioux City, graduated from Central High School in 1930. His parents had to move out in about 1937 to Los Angeles because the Martins were starting to invest in property out in the LA and California area. And that is how Edward Carey became connected with the entertainment industry. Edward sounded too boring, so he took his stage name as his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name, and that is how we know today as MacDonald Carey, rather than Edward Carey. MacDonald Carey became a famous actor. He was known as King of the Bees, starring in a whole bunch of bee movies in his era, but he was also on Broadway, he was in radio, and of course most people know him as Dr. Tom Horton on Days of Our Lives, which began in 1965 and is still going, which I didn't realize. I cannot believe that show. I mean, of course, it has a whole different cast and everything, and there's like guest appearances from the. But yeah, Days of Our Lives is still going, and I did not know that until I made this talk. All right, now you get the payoff for your Fitzgibbon's bookstore thing that I alluded to earlier. So Gerald Fitzgibbon came to Sioux City in 1889. He originally ran a cigar store that expanded into books and stationery. But his sons Gerald, Allen, and Maurice also operated the business with their father. Now, Maurice Fitzgibbon wanted to buy up his competition. So in 1912, he purchased the bookstore of Lawrence McCarty. Remember, McCarty was Grace's father, had started a grocery store, converted it to Catholic books and stationery. He bought that in 1912, and that is the store that became Fitzgibbon's. Maurice Fitzgibbon operated that store until 1957, and then he died in 1958. It was then sold to the Worth family in 1961 and the Sokoloski family in 1988. It finally closed in February of 2020. It had several locations around town, but up here you can see its final location at 609 5th Street. And our last family I'll discuss, the James O'Keefe family. James O'Keefe was born in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and he came to Sioux City around 1908. He joined the Sioux City Police Department, served as chief in the 20s, and then retired in 1930 and moved to Canada. But 3 of his 4 sons also served in the police force and were heavily involved in the police force. His oldest son, James O'Keefe Jr., joined the police force in 1940, and in 1953, he was elected as chief of police, and he served that position until 1968. To this date, this is the longest term as chief of police in Sioux City history. Here you can see Captain O'Keefe at his desk, and the Chief O'Keefe, rather, shouldn't downgrade him like that, as well as a letter he wrote to the people of Sioux City shortly after he became chief. His younger brother Frank was also part of the Sioux City Police Department. He joined in 1946 and was made captain in 1953. He was head of the Sioux City Police Department's Detective Bureau for a long time, from 1963 until 1975, and he eventually retired from the police force in 1981. So that covers Sioux City's Irish families, but I do want to mention some of our bishops, because two bishops of the Sioux City Diocese have also were either born in Ireland or have Irish ancestry. Our first bishop was Bishop Philip J. Garrigan. He was born in Ireland and ordained in Troy, New York in 1870. He was named the first bishop of the newly created Sioux City Diocese, March 21st, 1902. And he served that position until his death in October of 1919. If you're familiar with Trinity High School, which was once sat where Trinity Heights is now, Garrigan Hall, one of their major buildings up there, was named for Bishop Garrigan. Bishop Edmund J. Heelan was also Irish. He was born in Limerick and then ordained in Dublin at the ripe young age of 22. He served in Dubuque and Fort Dodge and came to Sioux City in 1919 to serve as associate bishop to Bishop Garrigan. He was consecrated on April 8th, the first bishop to be consecrated in Sioux City, and he remained as bishop until his death in 1948. Some of Bishop Heelan's accomplishments, because he was quite a prominent bishop while he was serving here in Sioux City. He confirmed over 75,000 people, ordained nearly 100 priests, and accepted 30 more into the diocese, established 10 new parishes, and he led the diocese through the Great Depression and World War II. Not an easy feat for any man. He also founded Briarcliff College as a girls-only college around 1930. Today it is coeducational, but Briarcliff College is, of course, still around. And he envisioned an interparochial school system for the diocese. There was a lot of different high schools and a lot of different schools. Bishop Heelan wanted one school in Sioux City that would be coeducational, where people from all over the diocese could come and attend high school. He launched pledge drives, he launched fundraisers, and unfortunately he died before he could see his dream completed. But 1 month after his death, the ground was broken at 11th and Douglas Street, and the school was named in Heelan's honor by the new bishop, Bishop Mueller. Though this building at 11th and Douglas has since now, of course, been torn down and replaced with the new Heelan High School just down the hill, but still named for Heelan and still honoring an Irish bishop. And here's a shot of Heelan High School from around the 1960s. All right, really quick, just wrapping up here in about 5 minutes. Just a few Irish organizations, some cool organizations that the Irish formed while they were living here in Sioux City. There are all kinds of Irish relief groups, again, supporting the Irish cause back home, as well as helping out Irish immigrants and Irish people with Irish ancestry living here in the United States and in Sioux City. You have the Ancient Order of Hibernians. This actually has its roots all the way back in Ireland in the 1500s. But the American branch formed in 1836. These Hibernians were all over the place, and again, advocating that Irish Republic cause. You had the Irish Relief Fund popping up here in Sioux City, again, raising that money to help out Irish people who were living here. And the Friendly Sons and Daughters of St. Patrick. This was a group organized to help people preserve and celebrate their Irish heritage. So they organized dances and balls and all these kinds of cool events. The modern St. Patrick's Day Parade actually has its roots in some of the events organized by this group. So that's pretty neat. Some other weirder clubs, the Shandawase Club, which was an Irish youth club, and we also had the Dulcimer Club. This is a dulcimer. It's actually a Turkish musical instrument. However, there was a special variation of it developed in the Appalachians by Irish immigrants. And if you hear Irish folk songs, especially those that have been written in America by people with Irish ancestry, you'll hear this dulcimer. It has a very, very unique sound. And has kind of almost become as popular as the fiddle with Irish folk songs. Over here you can see Johnny Sassano. He was an Italian immigrant. Irish festivals call for a lot of harp music. A harp is another traditional instrument. But there wasn't really an Irish harp player here, so he played harp for several of those Irish festivals. And I leave you with a Irish Gaelic phrase, go raibh meg agat, which is another way of saying thank you very much for coming out and attending this high noon. And remember, if you're going out celebrating your Irish heritage in St. Patrick's Day or whenever, make sure you're wearing a shamrock, not a four-leaf clover.